Hey everyone, and welcome to the exciting world of medieval India. In this video we're going to explore all the different groups of people who lived back then. Tribes, nomads, and the people who lived in towns and cities. From thick forests to wide open plains, medieval India was home to lots of different tribes, each with their own special ways of life, languages and traditions. These groups, who were often very close to nature, played a big part in shaping India's history and culture. So come along with me as we travel back in time to discover their stories, how they lived, how they adapted to changes, and how they left their mark on India's history. All across medieval India, many different tribal groups thrived. From the deep forests in the middle of India to the foothills of the Himalayas, these communities lived, their lives closely connected to nature. Some tribes were farmers, growing crops that were good for their local area. Others were hunters and gatherers, using their knowledge of the forest to find food. These groups, often connected by family ties, had their own social structures with chiefs and elders in charge. Even though they lived far from the busy cities, they weren't isolated. Trade routes connected these groups, allowing them to share goods, ideas, and traditions. The forests were filled with their unique languages, songs, and stories passed down through many generations. Their spiritual beliefs, often connected to nature, showed a deep respect for the balance of life. Forests, rivers, and mountains weren't just places on a map, but sacred spots, homes to gods and spirits. These tribes, even though they had different customs, all shared a strong connection to their land and a fierce desire to be independent. They adapted to the changing times in medieval India, keeping their own identities. Their story shows how strong and adaptable people can be, showing the many ways people lived with nature and shaped their own lives. While some people settled down in forests and plains, others chose to keep moving. These were the nomads, traveling across vast distances, following the seasons and searching for food and resources. Across the dry plains of Rajasthan and the Deccan Plateau, nomadic herders moved their cows, sheep and goats, looking for fresh grass. They moved with the changing weather, showing how adaptable and resourceful they were. These journeys weren't just about survival, they were important for trade and connecting different parts of medieval India. Nomads transported goods and animals across long distances, linking faraway places. Their travels exposed them to different cultures and ideas, making them important for sharing knowledge and traditions. Their caravans, sometimes stretching for miles, were a common sight, and their arrival in towns was always a big event. They brought not just goods, but also news and stories from distant lands. The Banjaras, for example, were famous traders, their caravans filled with salt, grains and cloth, connecting the center of India with the coasts. These nomads, though sometimes overlooked, played a big part in India's economy. They were the unsung heroes of trade and cultural exchange, their contributions woven into India's history. They remind us that progress isn't just about cities. Travel, with all its challenges and rewards, has always been a way for people to learn new things, adapt and share knowledge. Medieval India wasn't about isolated groups, but about how tribes, nomads and settled communities interacted with each other. These groups, though different in their lifestyles, were connected in many ways, shaping each other's lives. Trade was important for connecting these groups. Things like wood, honey, and medicinal plants went from tribal villages to busy towns and cities. In return, the towns provided things like cloth, salt, and tools, which the tribes needed. This trade also led to the sharing of ideas, beliefs, and customs. The lines between these groups were blurry, with people sometimes moving between settled and nomadic lives. Marriages between tribal groups and settled communities were common, mixing traditions. Religious places like temples and monasteries, often built near forests, brought tribal and non-tribal people together. This mix of cultures made medieval Indian society richer, creating a shared heritage even though people were so different. But these interactions weren't always peaceful. As kingdoms grew, fights over land and resources happened between settled communities and tribes. These times of both cooperation and conflict shaped India's history. Understanding these interactions is important for understanding medieval India. It helps us see how connected and fluid human communities really are. Medieval India wasn't just about just big empires and famous dynasties. It's also about how some tribal communities became powerful kingdoms. Across India, we see the rise of these kingdoms, challenging the existing rulers and creating their own territories. These kingdoms, often formed for unity and protection, showed the political skills and military strength of tribal leaders. In the Deccan Plateau, the Gond kingdom became very powerful. Their ambitious rulers built strong forts and created a central government. Their story shows how they became part of the political system while keeping their own culture. In the northeast, the Ahom kingdom, started by the Thai Ahom people who came from present-day Myanmar, created a strong state. They developed new ways of governing and fighting, resisting the Mughal Empire for centuries. These kingdoms, though different in their beginnings, showed that tribes weren't just watching history happen, but making history themselves. Their rise to power shows us that power doesn't belong to just one group. It highlights how dynamic medieval Indian society was, where ambition and opportunity could help even the least powerful groups become strong. The Mughal Empire, which changed the political map of medieval India, also impacted the remote tribal areas. Bringing these areas into the Mughal system brought big changes. Mughal emperors, understanding the importance of these regions, used both kindness and force. Tribal chiefs who agreed to Mughal rule were often allowed to stay in charge, becoming part of the empire. This created stability but also weakened some tribal leaders. The Mughals sent their own officials to collect taxes and keep order, making these areas part of the empire. But the Mughals didn't control everything. Many tribes fought hard to stay independent, using the forests and mountains to their advantage. The Mughal emperors, realizing that fighting wasn't always the best option, sometimes made agreements recognizing tribal rights to their forests and resources. This created some peace and allowed for trade and cultural exchange. Bringing tribal areas into the Mughal Empire was a complex process. It involved cooperation and conflict, agreement and resistance. This shaped the future of tribal communities. In the busy markets of Mughal India, with all the colorful silks, spices and jewels, few people realized how important the Banjaras were. These traveling traders, with their large caravans and knowledge of the land, were essential to the Mughal economy. The Banjaras, sometimes called the Kings of the Road, traveled vast distances connecting the Mughal Empire. Their caravans, sometimes miles long, carried important goods like salt, grain, cotton, and sugar, things the empire needed. They knew the routes, the seasons, and the local customs. They traveled through mountains, deserts, and forests, making sure goods reached the growing cities. The Mughal emperors, knowing how important they were, gave the Banjaras safe passage and sometimes even provided soldiers to protect them. The Banjaras did more than just transport goods. They were smart traders, understanding supply and demand, and often became wealthy. They connected producers and consumers, helping to keep prices stable. Their travels exposed them to many cultures and languages. They became important for cultural exchange, their camps becoming lively mixes of traditions. The Banjaras weren't just carriers of goods, they connected different parts of Mughal India. Their story shows that a strong economy needs not just powerful rulers, but also the hard work of ordinary people. Let's look at two important kingdoms, the Gonds and the Ahoms. Their stories show how strong, adaptable, and culturally rich tribal communities were. The Gond kingdom in the central highlands of India shows the skills of its rulers. Their impressive forts, beautifully carved temples, and advanced irrigation systems show how advanced they were. The Gonds supported art and culture, keeping their traditions alive through stories, music, and dance. In the northeast, the Ahom kingdom, created by the Thai Ahom people, developed its own identity. Their unique government, based on shared leadership and harmony, helped them survive for centuries, resisting the Mughals. The Ahoms' written histories give us valuable information about their culture and military strategies. Both the Gonds and the Ahoms respected nature. Their rituals, festivals, and buildings reflected this. They show that progress doesn't have to harm the environment. The Gonds and the Ahoms, through their political skills, rich culture, and lasting impact, challenged the existing power structures. Their stories remind us that history isn't just about empires, but also about the contributions of many different groups. A civilization's true value isn't just in its big buildings and written records, but also in its traditions, the stories, songs, dances, and rituals that give people their identity. The tribes of medieval India had a rich and vibrant culture that we can still see today. Their connection to nature was shown in their art. Carvings on wood and stone showed animals, trees, and stars, reflecting their respect for nature. Their dances, often performed outdoors, imitated animals and the seasons, celebrating the connection of all living things. Storytelling was important, with stories and legends passed down through generations. These stories taught lessons and helped people understand the world. Music was a big part of their lives, played at every important event. Their instruments, often made from natural materials, created melodies that reflected the sounds of nature. Even with many challenges, tribes protected their culture. Their traditions, passed down through generations, show how strong and creative they were, and how connected they were to their past. Exploring tribal culture shows us a world that's often overlooked. It's a world full of meaning, wisdom, and artistic expression, reminding us that true culture isn't about things, but about the traditions that connect a community. As we finish our look at tribes, nomads, and settled communities in medieval India, we see that history isn't just about empires, but about the lives of many different people. From the forest to the markets, each group, with its own customs and beliefs, contributed to India's rich culture. Their stories, often forgotten, teach us about how adaptable and connected human societies are. Thanks for joining me. If you enjoyed this trip through time, please like this video, subscribe for more history videos, and share it with others. Let's keep learning and exploring history together.